Thank you for tuning in to the World Builders Anvil, episode 110, The Triumphant Return of the Lobbyist-Funded Groundhog.
Let's build a solar system?
No. I see The Triumphant Return of the Lobbyist-Funded Groundhog. It's on the board. You're always yelling at me for not writing it on the board. I mean, I see over there it says episode 110, Let's Build a Solar System. But I still like The Triumphant Return of the Lobbyist-Funded Groundhog.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram, and I'm here with Milwaukee Mike, back from his day job.
Michael.
I'm sorry, Milwaukee Michael. I always get that wrong.
Now, why are you going with Milwaukee? That cracks me up because...
It's Punxsutawney Phil, and I was looking for an M-town.
Well, see, the funny thing is because I'm back in installation at work, I am frequently using my power drill all the time, and it is a Milwaukee. I'm a big fan of Milwaukee
Excellent.
Power Tools. So when you say Milwaukee Michael...
It's a double work, and if Milwaukee Power Tools wants to...
If they want to sponsor us...
We will take them on because...
Yeah, they're excellent. I love
really,
Milwaukee.
Really desperate.
Big fan.
We'll think about it.
Well, actually, what I would say is I'll remind everybody that Milwaukee makes excellent portable tools, and if you want to buy them, you could go to www.garduel.com/Amazon and order them from Amazon. They got some great stuff. And if you do that, it helps the show out. Doesn't change your prices for the better or the worse, but the show gets a little helping fundage. So please go to Amazon through www.garduel.
I just want to state right now, I never thought garduel.com/Amazon would be used to push power tools. But hey.
With me on the show, that you never thought that would be a possibility? I love power tools. It's kind of ironic considering the nerd fest that we usually are, a frenzy of nerd festing, but I am very much a power tool guy.
Yes, and I'm more your traditional nerd when it comes to tools. I believe they belong in other people's hands, like my wife or someone.
Right. Whereas I'm just like, give me a chop saw, hand saw, whatever. Give me a sawzall, power drill, whatever. We're actually talking about solar systems today. More specifically, not any solar systems we're aware of, but how to build one.
Yes. And so I thought this episode actually did a quick little theme song. So it'd be let's build a solar system, make them our best friend.
See, I would have gone with the sun is a mass of incandescent gas, a gigantic nuclear furnace. No?
No, I prefer my reference.
Where hydrogen is smashed into helium at a temperature of millions of degrees.
And for all the IP lawyers out there,
the sun is
his name is Michael.
Okay. The sun is like.
Okay.
The sun is far.
We're not to that part of the show yet. Okay.
And by that you mean the show tunes section?
Yes. Which will never be paid for.
Okay. It's actually They Might Be Giants.
I know who it is.
I don't think you knew.
Okay. I've actually heard both versions. The old one.
I've heard the old version.
Because they've updated it with modern science.
Science!
Okay.
Are you going to take a scientific approach to this?
No, I'm going to take a Jeffrey world-building approach to it.
So just an artistic approach to it.
An artistic approach.
Which is what I was going to lean towards, actually. Because I didn't get the chance to do all the research on black holes that you assigned to me.
Actually, micro black holes. That way we could...
I'm sorry, you did say micro black holes, yes. I didn't get to do my quantum physics research.
What we were talking about, I was actually just reading an article from Stephen Hawking. I don't know if you've heard of him or not.
Smart guy, glasses?
No. Someone else.
Different guy.
Different guy.
For the record, he does wear glasses.
And yes, I know. And he essentially came up with a new theorem that if you could find a micro black hole approximately the size of a mountain, you could actually use it to power the entire Earth.
I would imagine you could probably power more than just the Earth.
The trick would be to actually build the device to harness the energy?
Well, see, I mean, not to punch a hole in a theory of Stephen Hawking, because he's certainly infinitely smarter than I am, but there's enough energy bouncing out of the sun into Earth to power the Earth. We just don't have the equipment to harness it. Like solar panels, they only adequately harness. I want to say at this point our best ones are 17%.
Yeah, and that works really great at night.
It's not about the point. It's a twofold problem, Jeffrey. One, it's the ability to soak that energy up. Mm-hmm. So that's where the solar panel comes into play. And the second part is storage. So batteries. Now, the battery problem will be solved, in my opinion, within 50 to 100 years once we get carbon.
Won't be that long.
I don't think it will be. Yeah. I'm giving an outside estimate because I haven't been reading much on it. And frankly, I'm not in the lab working on this. But once they get carbon nanotube batteries down, mm-hmm. we're going to be it will change the face of our world. It will change all of our technologies.
Yes, and there are actually stackable, I believe, generators and battery units being developed for homes now to store solar energy in them, like a capacitor, which is one of the major issues we have with solar electricity. It fades very quickly.
The thing is, though, you're not going to see, I guarantee you, stuff like that, like big oil and big energy companies will prevent that from, I have a hard time believing that a technology advancement like that could eliminate the generators of electricity and the people that transmit and mm-hmm. make money off electricity.
Sure.
Because it's such a huge... energy is the biggest business on the planet.
Well, that's why they're passing laws now that will insist that the energy you generate is passed into the grid and they don't have to pay you back for it. Mm-hmm. And actually, you pretty much don't have to pay them for it anyway.
Yeah, but see, if they could make a unit like that, like a unit that I can just be off the grid
and talk to Mr. Musk.
I'll just build the house and
Mr. Musk is working on it right now.
Who? Musk?
Yeah.
I don't know who that is.
He is the guy who does Tesla cars, SpaceX, a brilliant engineer who believes in that kind of stuff, and so hopefully he can pull it off. But now
that's not what we're talking about.
Talk about solar systems that we're 42 minutes into the episode. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I want to talk about is scope. Scope is something I don't usually talk about a lot in world building because we usually talk about very finite issues. But one of the things to keep in consideration is what is the scope of the story you're telling. And a lot of times people don't think about this in fantasy. They think of medieval Earth. But even if it's a medieval style Earth, can they use magic to travel to other realms? Are those other realms actually other realms, or maybe are they other planets? Who knows? But, it's sort of the same quandary, or you definitely run into it in science fiction, where how fast can the characters move in the scope of the universe? Because the solar system is quite small in the scope of a universe, and the faster the characters in the story can traverse, the less meaningful some of these things actually might become in the story. But we're going to try and keep it more sort of, inability to traverse off the planet sort of style of world. Just for simplicity's sake, we'll cover a few things to think about beyond that, though, in the local solar system. So the thing you have to think about, too, is, like I said, that scope is very important when you're dealing in world building because, if, this guy can create a magical horse that can fly him to a planet in 2 seconds in another solar system, boy, you got a lot of building to do.
Well, or you go from, or you can do, I was going to say gunslinger, but you kind of can't. It has to be architect/gardener. But you could architect just the places they're going to.
Yeah.
You don't have to build your whole solar system or the solar system he's traveling to. Mm-hmm. Maybe just the planet.
If you're doing reactive fiction like books, but if you're doing interactive fiction like storytelling or making video games, that becomes a huge question. Mm-hmm. Or else, it's the classic video game. You're walking through the thing and there's a big cliff face and there's no way to ever get past the cliff face.
Yep.
And if you find some way to do it, you fall off the map and die. Lose all of your loot. Okay. But the first thing to think about are the sun or suns. From the planet you are on, those are typically the most noticeable thing in the solar system.
I kind of like to think about a few little things like just generically, is your world set in sort of the classic Earth Goldilocks zone? And that's the zone where habitable planets exist in sort of a normal orbit. Does your world have a elonged orbit? They're finding a lot of planets that have elonged orbits where they may become close to the sun and then they go far out from the sun. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the Game of Thrones world is set up that way because, winter lasts for so long and then it's gone for a while and it comes back.
Yeah, but I don't know. Has he ever explained it planetarily? Because
not that I know.
I get the impression that sometimes winter comes like I think in the story of what's going on now, winter's been gone for like 9 years or something like that. And so like every so many years, but it's not a set amount of time.
It's not a set amount. Well, so maybe it's just a magical thing.
At least from the television show, that's what I get. I haven't read the books, so.
The thing to keep in mind is you can deal with things naturalistically or magically. The important thing is when you come up with these things that it is actually set in a rule in your universe, and if you decide to break it, you need to have consequences for it. For example, if the planet doesn't tilt into axis, it doesn't have seasons unless something causes seasons. And so maybe there's a mechanism in place that causes the seasons in the world. What happens if the big bad guy destroys it? Or you have to destroy it to kill the big bad guy. What are the ramifications on the world? But beyond and more important than seasons and the scientific side of it, the thing to keep in mind are suns are typically very important. You look back to early cultures.
Worshipped as gods.
A lot of times worshipped as gods. The whole story of Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology is based on the cycle of the day. So as the sun comes up, Ra's carrying the sun, across the sky. And then when it goes down, he's dead. And when he comes back the next day, he's been reincarnated as Ra again. And that's the same life the Pharaoh lives, because the Pharaoh is Ra on earth at certain parts of his life, and these different gods the other. It's a little confusing. I think pharaohs span 4 different gods over the course of their life and death. But it's all really based on the cycle of a day. The cycle of a day has a huge impact on a planet that spins. Every culture has some influence by the sun. In some certain places, like desert areas, the sun might not be such a good thing because, when the heat of the day is out, people have to retreat and hide because it's so hot that, unless you're properly able to survive in it, you could be killed easily during the day in a desert area. So you probably don't have a really soft, lofty sun god in that kind of an area unless you live along a river. But nomads, it might be a little bit more harsh because the sun is the thing that could kill off your whole tribe if you get trapped in the wrong spot at the wrong time.
And you have to consider the size of your planet in conjunction with the sun and decide how long is your day. Different planets, different day lengths of a day.
Yeah.
Which would also, that one thing, that one detail can dramatically change the nature of your world and your story. Like, let's say your day is 44 hours. 44 hours from the beginning of the day till the beginning of the next day, which means maybe your people are actually up for half that day and sleeping for a third of that day, in which case they have a longer daytime, they have a longer work time. It completely alters culture and species and everything.
Well, maybe.
Or not.
The thing to keep in
I'm just
mind
throwing
is,
it out there. We're just accustomed to 24 hours on Earth, but that doesn't necessarily have to be what your story is.
It doesn't. And a good way to make it believable to people without putting a lot of heavy science into things are to play with things like, what happens if the planet doesn't tilt? Like I said, no seasons. How would that change the cultures in the north? How would that change the cultures around the equator? It could be vastly different. But, unless you're writing hard science fiction, most people will just take the general thing that you give them and they will suspend any disbelief, like, oh, something must change because of this. Something must be different. And it gives you flexibility to play with things that you want to, like, maybe your whole idea of your world is what if Earth didn't tilt? Or what if it tilted completely around? Who knows?
Did you ever see Chronicles of Riddick?
Not the Crown. I only saw the first one.
Pitch Black?
Yeah.
In the Chronicles of Riddick, there's a planet called Crematorium. It is a prison planet. Basically, they dropped a plug on the planet that's a building. So it's actually subterranean. The surface of the planet, because of... And they don't explain this. They just make a cool thing.
It's that way.
But I'm going to try to explain it in what I think makes a little bit of sense.
Okay.
The basic gist is, because of... And again, I am making... Everything I'm about to say, I'm making up.
Okay.
I'm guessing that because of the speed with which the planet spins and its distance from the sun or angle or however the atmosphere works, whatever, the side of the planet that is not facing the sun is so cold that you can't be on it. The temperature drops so dramatically that you cannot be out. You'll freeze to death. The side that's facing the sun is like
the opposite.
It's volcanic. Like it's literally melting earth everywhere. You can't be there. But there is an access of it where it's like this is the breaking point, and it's a point at which, while part of the planet is cooling and the other part starts to heat up, there's a window. It's only like a 20-minute window by foot.
Yeah.
So that's when they set the prison break. So they need to cover a certain amount of ground in a certain amount of time, because if they
can't go too far.
If they go any sooner, it'll be too cold. If they go any later, it'll be
too hot.
It'll be too hot.
Yes.
And it's really pretty. It's a neat mechanic which creates for some cool scenes in the movie.
Yeah, no, I've seen actually an interesting documentary was put together by scientists talking about what could alien life look like on other non-Earth-like worlds. And I'll see if I can find the documentary again. It's been a while, so...
The name eludes you.
It probably won't be in the show notes.
Fair enough.
But essentially, one of the interesting things they looked at was a plan like what you're talking about, to where one side's always facing the sun. And essentially how it would be interesting where there'd be, and like the moon does that. The moon, one side is always dark to Earth. And so they have this area of twilight that's perpetual dawn and dusk, basically around the edge away from the sun, because it's always going to be, in partial day, partial night. So like if you're in that area, it would be the zone of, where creatures could only actually see, or not they could only see, but it would be this specific zone where it would always be like being up at dawn or dusk on Earth. And like you said, you have the problems where it's really hot on one side, it's really cold on the other side. It's really dark, so to survive on the dark side, you would need to be able to see with not light. So you have to be able to see like infrared or something like that. And they came up with a very, very interesting critter that I remember that actually had a third eye, because competing with other creatures, it would have, their argument would be, it would be a simple evolution for a predator, because he could go into either zone and the creatures don't interact on all of the same levels he does, because he could see in either the light side or the infrared side. And so he would have an advantage. He could cross over where a lot of the predators around him would be stuck or be forced to go to sleep during that part if the prey got weak in that area. So there's a lot of interesting things you can do with critters if you're trying to develop them, if you take a different world. And my suggestion is, if you don't want an Earth-like world, really screw with something. Give it a long orbit. Make it not rotate. Make it not shift on its axis. All of these things would cause changes. Put it, where Mars is. Let's say Mars maintained its atmosphere and it had a radiation belt. It, in theory, could support life. So, but think of how much further it is away from the sun. A lot less heat gets to it. So what would the world be like even on the other part of the Goldilocks zone? So there's a lot of things that you can think about, and the sun is at the center of most of it. Adding multiple suns in fantasy is cool. In science fiction, you probably have a bit more of a difficulty explaining how radiation isn't slaughtering everything in the solar system. But hey, this is a fantasy world building show, and we made that quite clear in episode 1. So,
well, I suppose that you could argue, like, let's say for sake of argument, you've got, you take a look at Sol, and all the planets pretty much are on a very similar trajectory as far as like it's like a plane. I know Pluto is kind of tilted off, did a little different than everybody else, and everybody else.
It's an approximate.
It's an approximate
for the scope
plane.
of space. It's a plane.
Yeah, for the scope of space, it's a plane. So let's say, for sake of argument, that second sun was just above our sun. So one part of the planet would always see light. So you could say, okay, well, at certain parts, then the planets can see two suns, and then sometimes you can't. Yeah.
Because usually what would happen is the center of the solar system is not one of the suns. Like in our solar system, it's approximately the center of the sun. When you add in a secondary or a tertiary or multiple stars, it's really the center of all of their masses combined.
The fun part about actually what because I'm doing it in my head. The fun part about having it set up that way is on the planet. There would be people on the planet that have never seen the second sun. They would not know about it.
It's a heresy.
Yeah, but then if they travel to the northern hemisphere, they're like, oh, hey, whoa, there's two suns.
Yeah,
there's two suns here. Why do you have two suns here? We only have one sun down south.
Heretics.
Get rid of that sun.
Yeah, that's one of the major things to consider too. Is early religion mythology is a way to explain why things are the way they are, as well as why are we here, but more importantly, why are things the way they are, and what can we do to not die? And those are the earliest questions religions start to cover. And so everything visible in the night sky becomes subject to these things. If you have a second sun, it is meaningful.
Yeah, but if you're in the southern hemisphere, then you don't.
Well, on that world, but that would be a meaningful distinction between the two hemispheres and the scenario you've given up.
Well, right. Well, that's why I figure if we're talking about building one,
and the big thing to consider too is, in a fantasy world, you don't have to have it always grounded. I talk about naturalistic world building, but definitely don't feel constrained by that. I mean, one of the most famous fantasy stories of all time is Alice in Wonderland, and that's just whack.
Yeah.
Discworld is literally a flat world, and it's a fun, interesting place. But
is that the one on the turtle's back?
No, because it has the fence around it. It's the Terry Pratchett one.
Oh. The one I'm talking about, or the one you're talking about?
The one I'm talking about.
I'm pretty sure we're talking about the same thing. What's the one where it's like on a turtle's back floating through the universe?
I think that's a D&D one. I'm not sure.
It's positive.
So all I remember with his was at the edge there was a fence so you didn't sail off. The circumference.
Yeah.
So
so I'm also thinking about maybe you have two suns that are close enough. This one planet is kind of on the outskirts, and every so many years, based on the trajectory of it's spinning around the planet. It's spinning around the sun, orbiting. Depending on its orbiting trajectory, every now and then it breaks off and then goes around the other sun.
That would be a very unstable place. But
yeah, but wouldn't it be cool? Yeah. Isn't it a great idea?
There's actually...
it's one of those things. Like, well, I mean, you think about Earth. Earth is the perfect storm for life. Some people would say, oh, it was coincidence. It was the Big Bang Theory. Well, it's there because God. But it's the perfect storm for life. We are here. It's not an accident.
No.
It happened.
Yeah.
So why can't there's no reason I can't explain it in a fictional story that every once in a while this planet spins off and starts spinning around the other sun.
And I said, especially, if you're not reaching out to hard science.
No.
Fans, like I said, you can get away with a lot because usually fantasy readers, have a certain level where they can suspend disbelief, and that's why they're reading fantasy. And they don't care about the science so much. So as long as you can explain it and show the effects in your world, game on. Planets and moons. Once again, do you have multiple moons?
Now, let me ask you a question that you probably know the answer to, not being a big astronomy guy. What defines a moon versus a planet?
Moons rotate around planets.
Like that, but so it's not, because obviously, you take a look at our moon, it's pretty plain, but then you talk about, and I realize I'm jumping right into
Europa.
Science. Then you jump right into science fiction, and we'll say Endor is but
Endor could exist.
Endor could exist.
Yeah.
I know it could. That's why I'm saying
Ewoks cannot exist.
Let's be fair. Endor did exist.
No,
in a galaxy far, far away. a long time ago.
As long as we go with understand that Ewoks would have been wiped out by evolution.
You think so? Why?
It's more of a dream. I have no idea. I'm not really,
You realize the funny part about that, I know it's been covered in other things, is like the whole bit about the Ewoks eating all the stormtroopers. The Ewoks ate the stormtroopers. They ate them.
Probably.
And probably.
Yeah.
The beginning of the movie, they were going to eat Luke and Leia and Han and everybody.
Yeah.
And C-3PO stopped them by being a magic flying golden god. Then there was a small war with stormtroopers, and the Ewoks killed all them. Then they ate them, and that was the big party at the end.
Yeah, and they were playing.
And they were playing.
Yeah.
Right, yes, they were. They were playing drums on the helmets.
I can buy that, but I still hate Ewoks.
You can hate them, but they're still cannibalistic
better than
savages.
the Jar Jar Binks race, but Okay.
So moons. The point is that moons are satellites for planets.
Mm-hmm.
They can't be if they were their own thing around a sun, they'd be a planet.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can have certain fun things here as well too, like
so you can't say have a planet orbiting a planet. You'd classify it as a moon. It's just a classification.
Yes.
Okay.
And like I said, there are moons larger than Earth.
Oh yeah.
There are planets smaller than moons, which is sort of redundant, but yeah.
Well, if you say there's moons bigger than Earth, then you're saying the
once
same
again,
thing in reverse.
There's some of the same sorts of things you can play with moons, like how fast does the moon travel around the planet? We see it once a night here on Earth. Essentially about every 30 days we see all of its phases, and that essentially becomes 1 month. So if the length of that rotation is different, their perception of a month could be different. Maybe it takes a whole year for one of those things, like Earth years, for it to go around. Their whole
idea. So it would be really special when the moon pops up because you don't get to see it very often.
Exactly. It's just one of those things to keep in mind. You can play with it too. It's once again, they're very big. They're very visible in the night sky. Early on, people come up with ways to explain why they're there, what's all going on above us. There's like this story that happens, with the stars.
I think it's fair to say that we all know that any primitive culture is going to come up with a way to start explaining celestial bodies just because they're looking up at the sky. Yeah. There's a given thing up there. Why I'm going to make something up to explain why it's there.
Yes, because one, you are probably pretty bored once the sun goes down because you're not out doing things unless you can see.
Or maybe you're only doing things at night, Jeff. Maybe they're a nighttime creature being.
Then they probably wouldn't have many stories about the night because...
we don't have stories about the day?
No, we don't. Name one. You can't. Okay.
You're a fiction writer, and you lie.
Yeah, but my point being is when they sit down and rest in the evening...
Or daytime.
Hunter-gatherer races, not races, but hunter-gatherer peoples, don't typically sleep longer than people do. So they're up for several hours. If it gets dark early, they're still up for several hours. So that lends to more storytelling within the culture. And the things that you're looking at that point are probably going to have more stories about them. That's just a guess, but that's the reason why, they put all of the gods in the skies, because that's when they were sitting there thinking about it and attaching things, Planets are gods, not stars. Why? They look different in the night sky. Stars twinkle. They can be very bright at times, especially if they're exploding and you can see the explosion. There was actually just one, and they're thinking that it might be one of the brightest explosions ever seen on Earth of a star. It's so bright that you could see it if nothing but the moon was visible because it was so bright. For a while, it was sort of hanging out around the moon. You might have seen this thing that looked like a really fuzzy star, but big. And it was actually a supernova somewhere. And that in itself, anything visible, even though that's not in the same solar system, is important. There are Christians I know who do argue that the Star of David was a supernova, and they try and tie the time back to that. You go back into old cultures that really looked at astronomy, because some cultures are much different than other ones, like the Chinese, the Babylonians. And then from the Babylonians, the Greeks, you go to Mesoamerican Indians were very big we know into astronomy and astrology on top of it. Everything becomes very important. The streak you see through the sky at night, the thing that we call the Milky Way. Most planets are going to have that because all that really is that's the denser, dustier part of the center of the galaxy, essentially. And it might look different on planet to planet depending on where you are in the spinning of the galaxy, but you're going to have those sort of white lines that sort of cut through the solar system. On Gardul, I actually have a nebula that can be seen, and sometimes if it's very active, can even sort of pop up during the day. Not brightly, but can shine through a little bit, especially around dawn and dusk. And that's probably also scientifically not realistic, but I thought it was a neat thing, and I wanted to have this purple nebula that was important to the cultures, so I went with it.
Poof. Purple nebula.
Purple nebula. The visible planets are important because, unlike the twinkling stars, when they pass through the night sky, what you'll see is a solid, probably brighter object. So it's a little bit brighter than the stars if you spend a lot of time out there, and they don't blink because they're truly just reflecting. There's no twinkling. So they stand out, even though, you look at like Mars in the sky or Jupiter, those are the two, and Venus, those are the three bright ones. And we can see a few other ones as well too. Those stood out a lot more, and that's the reason why those were assigned to Jupiter, and these were gods assigned to these things because they were considered that important. Look, you can see Jupiter in the sky tonight. You're seeing the god moving through the sky.
Moves kind of slow, that Jupiter.
So, major comets, especially ones that repeat, become important. I know the Chinese would actually, they could tell certain kinds of comets, and they would actually make notes of they called it a bearded comet, which was a comet that had the trail, and that's because it was too close, the sun was melting. Yeah, Halley's Comet, that'd be a bearded comet if I remember correctly, because in the old Chinese thing, and so years where it would come through, it got marked down, and you're pretty reasonably sure that most of the cultures that were big in astronomy knew it was coming back. Because they have long memories, especially when you have much else to do, when you don't have an iPhone or an Android phone to play games on. You think about this stuff over and over and over again.
And if you need to buy an Android phone or an iPhone, you can go to www.gardul.com/Amazon.
So essentially, those are the core things. So when you're building a solar system, those are the things you have to think about. What can you see from the planet? And it's somewhat similar to the episode where I talked about solar systems. And I go to a little bit more detail in that episode about these things. But this time we're talking a little bit more about why you want to choose things. If you want something different, they find all kinds of wacky things. They have this thing now called the hot Jupiter, which is not something that is bad to look up on the internet like you might think from the name.
I was just say, it almost sounds like a flaming mixed drink.
Yes, it's not a flaming mixed drink. It's literally, and a lot of the solar systems, a lot of the planets they found are these things they call hot Jupiters. So it's actually common. What they're having trouble finding are solar systems like ours, actually. But a hot Jupiter is a giant gas planet in Mercury's orbit. And the net effect is it rips around its sun at a very high rate, and it's essentially on fire. It's a burning gas giant that's ripping around the sun. It's very close to it. But think of the visual, in the night sky there. You think Jupiter is bright in the sky today? I mean, that would be something immense. Maybe that's two gods in the midst of a battle. And maybe your cultures are picking sides to help their god win.
Imagine being an inhabitable moon around that planet.
Oh, yeah. Well, you would need...
Oh, yeah, I know, but...
Whatever.
Yeah.
You can
have science.
There's other things you can do, too. Like, there's a belief that when gas giants approximate they're just a little too small to turn into a sun. Like Jupiter's nowhere close, so you can have much more massive gas giants than Jupiter. And when they get to a certain point, they then collapse upon themselves, creating the fusion reaction, which turns into a sun. So they're just probably a little too small to become a secondary sun in that solar system. But they start to, because of the pressure, they're starting to exude heat. So if you had a large Earth-like planet, which there are some Earth-like moons, around Jupiter, if Jupiter was much bigger and it started exuding a lot of heat because it was starting to approach the place where it turned into a sun, you could maybe have an actual, Earth-like planet as a moon, aka an Endor.
Could you have one of these hot Jupiters become a sun while revolving around a sun? Like, what would happen at that point?
It would become a binary system. So essentially the center mass of the suns, will be based off of, the total mass and then the size of their orbit. There's some math stuff there.
But would it still keep moving around it? Or,
oh yeah,
yeah, it would.
Yeah,
collapse.
in a binary or multiple star system, the suns rotate around each other.
Okay.
To wherever the center mass is. So if you have one gigantic sun and one smaller sun, maybe the orbit isn't that much different than what being in an Earth-like system. But if the suns were about the same size, somewhere between them, almost in the middle, would be where they're both rotating around.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So, like, the center point would not be on the larger sun. It would be somewhere between the two of them, based on whichever
in the middle of
one
space, potentially.
Whichever one was bigger.
Exactly.
So,
and there are some neat things, like some real things where you can actually build solar systems.
like
and
kind of like a rotating.
It does the math for you. It's kind of neat, where you can actually throw in a solar system and then you just start adding in planets. Like, I want this kind of a sun, and you start throwing in different planets into orbits.
Kind of like your map generator, but a solar system generator.
Yeah, and it's a free web app from some EDU place, and it's kind of neat because it'll just keep rotating the stuff, and the idea, it's a game where you're trying to add in the most mass as you can, and then when the math fails, you'll start to see planets winging off, and game over. There's another neat, and I'll link this one in there. If you want a quick way to come up with the what you can see from your planet, there's a website called Donjon, DONJON, I believe, .com, and he creates all kinds of interesting role-playing online generators. One of them is actually, it's very cool. You can say, this is my planet, and then you say how many moons there are. You put in a few numbers, and it will generate how long the cycles of the months are for each planet, their entire cycle span around the planet, and will actually throw in random events for comets and stuff like that. So you can just sort of take this calendar and say, I'm starting here, and use it as inspiration to sort of throw loops into your story. Like, wait, right near the, right at the beginning, there's a comet. What effect does that have? A lot of people think, the Star of David was important because, it was apparently over this town. And so something big must be happening there. And that's what supposedly drew in the three kings of the Orient East, or whatever they call it in whichever version of the Bible you read, if you've read one. Now, if you start going to where there's some movement capacity, be it through magic or anything, you do have to think about your other planets.
When you say movement capacity, you're talking about of a living being on the planet to move from the planet
throughout the solar system. There will be other planets that you can't see. Your further out planets, even if they're relatively large, just from a distance basis, you won't see. So like on Earth, I believe we can see 6 planets in optimal conditions at night, I believe. 5 or 6, and then there's 3 we can't see. And those are the ones that are further out. Just because of the distance, we can't see them without telescopes. So there might be other planets. Some orbits might not have a planet. That's how you get asteroid belts. They are, for whatever reason, the planet formation didn't quite come together, so you have a bunch of big rocks floating through, but it'll be a certain orbit radius around a planet or around the sun. Or potentially a planet. That's why you have rings around planets, too.
And to be fair, asteroid belts do not look like the ones in Star Wars. Like, they are so far apart. It's like every X amount of thousands of miles, there's another rock flying around.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh my gosh, we've just gone, we're moving through a flying junkyard of stuff.
Yeah. And there might be pockets of that, though, in them.
And I'm not saying it's not possible, but general.
Consistently through. It's not like a ring around a planet. And even those probably have a little more space than what we think, too. But I have no clue. Oort clouds. Solar systems have even more debris, and they're further out, and you can't see them. Occasionally, parts of them break off and wing in here, and we call those comets. Essentially, I have no real sciencey information outside of them. There's this sort of thin cloud of debris that we can't see at some extent orbit of the solar system that is really orbiting around the sun still, and that's why it's still classified. And that's the end of the solar system. Once you get through the Oort clouds, you're out in. Beyond actual planets, you might have things called dwarf planets. Dwarf planets.
Dwarf planets.
And they're kind of like a moon-sized object rotating around the sun. Think of Pluto. People argue back and forth because Pluto's traditionally been a planet, but there are actually several objects in the solar system that we know of that are bigger than Pluto that we don't call planets. And that was the reason why it got killed off back in, I think, 2008. Or 2000, early 2000s somewhere. It got killed off of being a planet.
If it orbits around, I thought the thing, what is it now? What are they calling it now?
It's a dwarf planet.
It's a dwarf planet, okay.
Because some people argue that if you don't, there are more objects that we didn't know when we created the names of the planets. I think it's it's kind of a cop-out.
Our solar system effectively has more planets?
Yeah, oh, yes.
Really?
Dwarf planets, though. Yes.
How many?
I believe.
Roughly?
I have no idea. I believe there are 5 or 6 that are larger than Pluto.
Wow.
Yeah. But yeah, they're just so far out that something relatively recently they've been found, and their argument is, do we make these all planets? No. And I'm like, just make them planets. Who cares? If it orbits the sun, let's keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
But, and in your solar system, whether you define them as a dwarf planet or not, there are more objects than, what we call planets in the solar system that revolve around the sun. And they're light planets. And then you have all kinds of life on planets, do you like an ice planet, because there's some thought that not only that, Neptune could have life because there's huge geothermal activity underneath. It could be warm enough for life in the water to, I think it's Pluto. It might be one of the moons around Jupiter. I might be wrong, but it's one of the ice water planets or moons in the system that has so much geothermal activity that they think it might actually be able to sustain life underneath the ice, closer to the warmth parts. That's the amazing thing with life is, a lot of times, you'll hear people talk about ideas of like silicon-based life forms and stuff like that. If you look at the extremophile creatures on Earth, things that live in really unusual places, they're starting to think they have no clue. This silicon life, they think some of it might even come from space on asteroids. So it's really up to your imagination. Like I said, especially if you're not targeting hard science people, go just make up a rule for your world. This is the rule for the world. And that's why things the way they are. And it does make for a cataclysmic change if you change something. But, just realize that there will be a consequence for changing stuff. Much earlier in Earth's atmosphere, we had giant insects. And that was because there was very little oxygen. And so the insects got really huge. And as the oxygen essentially thickened in the atmosphere, insects shrunk down. That's why we have small bugs now, and we used to have giant bugs. I believe it's oxygen. I saw that in some documentaries.
How big were the biggest bugs?
Meters.
Meters?
Yes.
Like
like freaking meters big. So like a freaking mosquito would land on your head and just like just
Eat you.
yeah, essentially, yeah. And we already covered that. I want to throw out one resource towards you here. You don't need the whole system to do it, but if you never thought much about it and you want to spend more time, even if it's just like explanationary wise, get one of the GURP space books. And if you want to make a very realistic solar system, it will allow you to do that. I know in the older edition, it was only really allowing you to make a sort of Earth-like solar systems. But I mean, it'll walk you through the math if you want to do it that way. And it gives you a lot of things to think about outside of just the planet. You know, like now that you have planets, are there, breathable atmospheres? What lives on those planets? It'll give you a lot of stuff to think about. It's a lot of food for thought. You don't need the whole game system if you're not a role player, but it's based on actual science in there. So if you go in there and just for food for thought, I think it's a great supplement. I would, if I own it. I could have done all the math for my solar system if I wanted to, but for me, it's not important to the story. I want to feel the way I want it to feel. So I get sort of basic concepts like as I get further from the sun, each orbit is a little further away than the previous orbit. They start to stretch out. And then over time, the sun just doesn't have enough gravity to keep things in orbit anymore. So now on to the world building task of the year, or of the day.
I don't think anyone's going to see this one coming.
No, this one, we threw you for a loop. Usually, we want to do something related back to the topic. What is the world building? You go ahead and you get to read this.
It's surprisingly totally off topic. Build a solar system.
And I think originally in the notes when Mike wrote this one down, he put "duh" next to it because we are that predictable.
Well, I mean, it's appropriate. I mean, if we're going to do an episode topic that our
you can
goal,
do something
our goal is for people to use it, and if they're and again, as with one of the prior episodes, if only for a test bed.
It's like online, you'll see a lot of writers who try and interact with writers online. They'll do writing prompts. So it's like, here's a writing prompt, and then people will respond to the writing prompts if they want to. But it's exercise. It's like it's like practicing using a power screwdriver or one of those power tools that Mike uses.
Yep. 10,000 hours. 10,000 hours makes you an expert. So if you want 10,000 hours of world building, even if it's world building tasks that you don't like, they'll still make you better. So build a solar system.
And even if you don't end up using it in the style that you do once, do it once to get a feel for it. And then it gives you the food for thought, the ammunition in the brain.
I know you're saying food for thought, but every time you say it, it sounds like you're saying food for thought.
Either or. I'm not picky. Okay, and now you also get to do the real world task of today.
The real world task of today is, now, I realize that will this be published by Sunday?
It'll be published on Sunday.
Okay, so if you're listening to this on Sunday, the day it is published, you're listening to it on Valentine's Day. So I thought it appropriate not only for Valentine's Day, but also in the spirit of celestial bodies to write a loving horoscope for your mate. Or if you don't have one, for yourself.
Yeah.
Or a friend. Your dog. A cat.
Yeah, and
your parents.
And it's okay if you don't believe in them. Who cares?
Yeah, which is why it's fun. You can just make one. Yeah, it's still a creative endeavor. So make a loving horoscope.
And if you want to do a scientific experiment and you know how to write a real horoscope and you do a bunch of research because you're crazy like I am, do a horoscope that is not theirs and give it to them and see what they say.
What do you mean it's not theirs? It's not their sign?
Yeah. Pick any sign randomly and do a horoscope for it if you know how. If you don't, research it and give it to them and see if they can tell the difference.
And one other fun thing that you guys can totally look up that I watched the other day and I totally recommend watching is Stephen Hawking's versus Paul Rudd in Quantum Chess. It's about this. It's like a 6 or 7 minute video that is really funny. That's all.
Excellent. What would life be without a little quantum chess?
Quantum chess.
And now, what is the tease for the next episode, Michael?
So the tease for the next episode is color. So, the color. Just color.
Just
color. Yeah, color.
And as always, make sure to go to Gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.